So I'll hand over to Janet. Thank you.
Salam alaikum. Bonjour tout le monde. Buenas tardes, amigos y amigas. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great honor to be here to be asked to address this important question. Also, warm thanks to the Tunisian hosts for being here. It's a wonderful privilege to be in this region at this historic time. And it's a wonderful opportunity, of course, for the World Social Forum also to be here. And thanks to Hilda and others who have been part of organizing this event. So in terms of this question about decolonizing the World Social Forum and decolonizing knowledge, the first thing I want to say is that when we talk about decolonizing knowledge, I want to make a distinction between decolonizing knowledge and producing anti-imperialist knowledge, anti-capitalist knowledge, popular knowledge, or activist knowledge. These are all important critical knowledges, all important alternative knowledges, but this is not the same as decolonizing knowledge. When I and others talk about decolonizing knowledge, we're talking about a relationship to a historically specific condition of coloniality. And coloniality as a condition of the present, not a condition of the past. It's also a condition of the past, but it's a condition of the present. And coloniality as a global condition, although clearly very different in different places, in relationship to different histories and different colonialisms, some of which predate European colonialism, are other than European colonialism, but certainly European colonialism is a major reference point in many places when we're talking about decolonizing knowledge. I live in Canada, so for me, the Americas is the region of the world in which I live my life and enact my politics and think about the question of decolonizing knowledges. And so in the Americas, it's particularly important to recognize that we live in settler colonial states in the Americas that are liberal democracies, but are also founded on colonial projects that have been premised on the theft of indigenous land and the destruction of indigenous civilizations. And this is a very important starting point for thinking about decolonizing knowledge and politics in the Americas. This is also a very important starting point in thinking about decolonizing knowledge in and about the World Social Forum. Because the World Social Forum, its home place is in Brazil. And the Americas, of course, has been a very important zone for the World Social Forum. And the Latin American context and the Latin American left is a very important pole in the Social Forum. So when we talk about decolonizing knowledge, it's also important to think about how this is distinct from how coloniality and decolonizing knowledge and politics is distinct from the question of political decolonization. So when people talk about political decolonization, they're talking about, independence movements that won formal independence from European colonial powers. There's a big debate about to what extent decolonization can be thought to have occurred. But really, we're not talking about political decolonization, we're talking about coloniality as an ongoing condition in the present. That, of course, is very connected to the globalization of capitalism, of capitalist modernity, but central also to that is the hegemony of the dominant civilization, of the civilization that has dominated the world for the last 400 to 500 years. And that's a specific civilization. It's Western civilization. It's the civilization of the conquest. It's the civilization that emanated from Europe and conquered the Americas in the late 15th century. And this is the civilization of Western modernity, of capitalism that is Eurocentric, that remains Eurocentric, that privileges whiteness, that privileges knowledges emanating from European and Euro-descendant bodies, and has projected into other global spaces particular kinds of patriarchies, and in the present particular notions about what a liberation from patriarchy looks like. The World Social Forum is also a product of this civilization, of this dominant civilization. It's a product of Western modernity. Now, it's a product of the emancipatory traditions of Western modernity, but no less a product of Western modernity. So in the social forum, we can identify the very important presence of liberalisms, socialisms, anarchisms, feminisms. These are all strong and contesting political currents within the social forum, that they've been there from the beginning. They help constitute the forum. I would say liberalisms and socialisms are particularly powerful in the forum, but anarchisms and feminisms are no less central, although they're a lot more marginalized in terms of authority in the forum and the kinds of knowledges that have been produced about the forum. So the World Social Forum, despite the fact that it has traveled to regions outside the West and outside the Americas, I would argue is still very much a product of Western modernity. And it reflects the contradictions and the contestations of Western modernity. That's not to say that there are not other traditions present in the forum, and I'll get to that. But I wanted to try to make this discussion concrete by giving you a very concrete example. And so for the last 5 years or so, to try to understand these dynamics within the forum, I've been studying the positionality of indigenous peoples in the Americas in relationship to the World Social Forum process. And I want to share with you an example of what I mean when I talk about the hegemony of Western knowledges that persists in the forum, despite the fact that the forum is critical and oppositional, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, and so on. Indigenous peoples in the World Social Forum have been present from the beginning. However, they were particularly present in a big way in Belém, Brazil, in 2009 in the Social Forum, in which there were over 2,000 indigenous people from the Americas present. They were very visible, they were very audible in some respects, their presence was very celebrated, but I would argue that the knowledges that indigenous peoples, especially of Brazil and the Andean region, that were present in the forum were only very partially and selectively heard by the non-indigenous majority in the forum. Okay, so they're present, they're visible, they're celebrated, they're photographed, they become icons of the forum, but their knowledges are only very partially heard and very partially taken up. So just as an example, in 2009 in the Social Forum, the forum happened immediately in the wake of the global financial meltdown in 2008. And everywhere in the World Social Forum, there were discourses of crisis, of the global crisis, of the economic crisis, of multiple forms of crisis. And indigenous peoples came into the forum with also talking about crisis, their own understandings of crisis. For indigenous peoples in Belém, they talked about the crisis of the conquest. The crisis for them is a crisis that's 500 years old. It's a crisis that was visited upon them with the arrival of the Europeans in the Americas. And so the crisis represented a crisis of the destruction of their societies, of their cultures, of their civilization, of their languages, of their spirituality, of their political systems, and so on. In the Belém Social Forum, the indigenous peoples present talked about the centrality for them of the defense of their territories, of reclaiming their territories, of preventing ongoing encroachment onto their territories, the centrality for them of autonomous self-organization and self-governance, of self-determination, of autonomy. They also spoke of their relationship with Mother Earth, with the earth as a living, sentient being, of their relations with non-human beings, with animal creatures, but also with rocks and trees and mountains and air and water. They talked of their vision for an alternative for humanity, which was centered around the idea of buen vivir, of the desire for a good life, not a better life, and a good life for all, which meant that a break from the paradigm of growth and progress and development. They criticized the persistence of Eurocentrism in the societies in which they live, but also in terms of the progressive movements that continues to insist on a certain kind of universalisms and the superiority of Western civilization and Western knowledge. And that this, of course, is very related to the racism at the heart of Western civilization and its history. So in the forum, the indigenous participants had their own big space, and they spoke in these ways over 4 or 5 days in the forum. However, in the spaces outside the indigenous tent, the discourses of crisis were persistently about the financial crisis, about the crisis of capitalism, about the economic crisis. In some circles where the discourse got bigger, the discourse was about multifaceted forms of crisis, the crisis of food, the crisis of water, the crisis of the climate. And in larger circles still, it became a discussion about the crisis of productivism, of developmental paradigms. But it's very interesting to think about what was not heard there, what was not picked up. So even with the celebration of indigenous presence in the forum, and the noting of indigenous, how the indigenous had come into the forum, that the discourses of crisis outside those indigenous circles never mentioned the conquest, never mentioned the ongoing problem of Eurocentrism, never mentioned the ongoing problem of racism, never mentioned the indigenous knowledges of alternatives to the crisis that indigenous participants were trying to share. It seems to me that in the Americas, when we think about decolonizing knowledge inside the social forum, that non-indigenous participants, and particularly European and Euro-descendant participants, need to examine the specificity of our own notions of alternatives to the present, of the kinds of ways we imagine struggle, of the ways we imagine utopia. At the center of that, of course, is the question of the state. The state remains central for so many non-indigenous utopias. The citizen subjectivities remain central to how we think about democracy, and democracy is an alternative, and liberal democracy is an alternative, and kind of national polities that are all-inclusive as an alternative. These are quite at odds with indigenous ideas about alternative futures. Okay, in the last minute that I have, I'll just close by saying, when we talk about knowledge and power and the relation of these within the social forum and in producing knowledge about the social forum, on the one hand, it's really important to recognize that there is a huge, great, maybe historically unprecedented diversity of critical knowledges, activist knowledges, popular knowledges, subaltern knowledges of all kinds that are circulating within the space of the social forum, but they're not interacting with each other on an equal playing field. And for those of us who come from the dominant civilization, it's a huge challenge to us to learn how to perceive what we do not hear. We need to grow ears to hear the knowledges that are present but subalternized in the space of the forum. So the task of decolonizing knowledge is not simply to replace one knowledge system with another, but to recognize deep civilizational difference that exists among us, and to learn how to dialogue with that difference in a non-domineering way, in a way that recognizes the historical coloniality of Western knowledges and enters into a dialogue on a different basis than has been possible in the past. And then my last sentence, I'll just say that in terms of producing knowledge about the forum, I think it's really important to recognize the ongoing great power of print knowledge and the authority of print. And that the knowledges that get written down, and get written down in the dominant European languages, These are the knowledges that circulate internationally